Thank you, Max. Yeah, now I want to shortly introduce to you Oliver Richmond. And then I hand over to you, Max. And then we can move on to our first panel about South Sudan. So Oliver Richmond is a leading scholar in the field of international relations and peace and conflict studies. He's a professor at the University of Manchester. In 2019, he received an Eminent Scholar Award from the International Studies Association. He has worked with international actors, especially the UN and civil society organizations in several conflict-affected areas around the world. And he has also conducted fieldwork on local, state, and international problems of peace building. Yeah, not only in Timor-Leste, Sri Lanka, Cyprus, Bosnia, and Kosovo, and Colombia. Without further ado, I hand over to you, Oliver. Let's dig deeper into your work. And I'm very glad and honored that you found the time and that you followed our invitation. And let's introduce your theories and concepts, and please tell us about your latest findings.
Oh, thank you, Yusuf and Max and David and all of you also for being here to listen to me briefly. So I'll just take about 20 minutes or so, I think. That's as per my instructions. So I'm going to launch right in. I, of course, am Western trained and had experience, even before I started doing research in this area, on the limitations and problematic nature of Western style attempts to do peacekeeping and mediation and diplomacy and these sorts of things. In some of it firsthand in Northern Ireland and Cyprus and so on. And when I started to work on it, of course, as a scholar, I was directed by other scholars and my supervisors and all the rest of it to focus on the sort of knowledge nexus that had emerged in the field of conflict studies, conflict research, peace research, these intersecting fields that came from different areas, mainly of the global north, US, Scandinavian, British and European academia, Australian too, I think at that point. And they, in this time-honored kind of Western rationality or epistemological framework, directs me to work through concepts like peacekeeping and mediation and all of these sorts of things. And I had begun to wonder why that sort of top-down, rather elitist, state-centric, or multilateral style, international law style epistemological package was being used for thinking about peace and conflict when if you were on the ground talking to the subjects of insecurity in conflict-affected societies, they would often, one, be able to render very distinct and succinct analyses of what had caused their conflict and what might be done about it in both linguistic but also epistemological ways which made sense to them and were rather clear to me. So it seemed to me that we were talking about two different worlds of peace and conflict. The world that was seen through the conceptual packaging of the global north, and another world that was seen by the subjects of conflict-affected societies. And both of these worlds are able to communicate clearly. Of course, there are different types of blockages in those communications, but there is clear communication, but it's a dialogue of the deaf and it's not being heard. And there's a hierarchy in terms of how much is being heard. Anyway, over a very long course of time, this got me thinking about how peace looks in situ, in context, how peacemaking and its tools would therefore be framed in conflict-affected societies. What kinds of things would be done? And I don't want to pretend that when I refer to these alternative, contextual, local, agential rationalities of peacemaking, that everybody's involved. I mean, I think it's true to say that peace-oriented civil society is a small minority of civil society and social movements, and connect with smaller groups in society than rather mainstream political, economic, social, cultural, and historical dynamics. But one thing that's become clear to me is that in the international organizations, as well as in local peace debates, there are very common agendas, similar agendas. And those groups who are capable of elucidating these kind of epistemological framings of peace are either self-censoring or are not being heard in the wider debates. So it's a short step from that to talk about beginning to abandon Eurocentric, state-centric, elite-oriented, state-driven, security-oriented approaches to peacemaking, and try to see and to think through the connections with the very latest cutting-edge thinking on peace across now a very wide range of disciplines. It's become more and more interdisciplinary, as well as east-west, north-south, and the social civil movements on the ground that either are familiar with this knowledge because of its dissemination, or intuitively connect with it a priori. So this brings me to the first key point. I've done a lot of work recently on the formation of what I'm calling an international peace architecture, which is a kind of major system in world history and world politics, which has emerged and evolved over a long period of time, and has developed and has been consciously designed more recently to respond to the existential threats of war for societies as well as for international order and its different systems. And this architecture is not well known or well mapped or well understood, but it's a kind of hidden structure behind the international system, the donor system, the state system, the different tools we have for dealing with peace, from the formation of political order through to things like peacekeeping and these sorts of things. And as I understand it, this entire historical framing of peace architecture, which is now coming more fully into our view, we can see it with more advanced methodologies and interdisciplinary perspectives, and also more contextualized knowledge, which has emerged more recently. This has been led by the sorts of groups who do local peace building historically. They produce the ideas with contextual knowledge, they're empirically tested, they're culturally resonant, they have legitimacy in society after war. They're often picked up by political elites when they are desperate for some kind of solution to an unending war they've got themselves locked into through their own failed perspectives and limited peace tools. And then they're finally adopted and they become systemic. So from these small ideas and movements, you eventually get insertions, structural insertions into international and local political order. Now this, F.R. Hinsley wrote about something like this in the 1960s. He was beginning to understand this, and he said, there's a big gap between the production of local knowledge about peacemaking and its wider systemic adaptation or adoption at the international level. And he estimated the gap was about 300 years. And that all sounds a bit reductionist, of course, but the point that I'm trying to make is that if we take it that local peacemaking, its agency and its goals have filtered up to the state and to the international multilateral order and international law and so on, and been influential, mysteriously influential, because they are so weak, they don't have direct forms of power, although they often have social, cultural forms of power. And that filters in and shapes the international order and its peacemaking tools, and every order needs peacemaking tools to maintain itself. Then to understand the future of peacemaking, we have to look at what local peace actors are doing now around the world. We have to hope that the future of peacemaking is not a future 300 years in the future, as Hinsley suggested, but that this process has been speeded up by new capacities, interdisciplinarity, new forms of communication and knowledge dissemination, new technologies, the growth of networks. In other words, an embryonic shift in international order from a world in which you made peace between states, according to hegemonic interests filtered through multilateralism, to a world in which local peace actors are able to shape and influence networks, mobility, dynamism, pluriversality, polygogue, and so on. And a lot of this comes from those concepts that I've just mentioned, come from those local peace actors who are often situated in the global south, have experience of diversity and plurality, have long designed very small tools to mitigate and mediate conflicts in their own contexts, and so on. So there's some hope there, but the problem is that the peace system that we have that has emerged using this type of time-lapse methodology over the last centuries is reactive. It's always designed with the last form of war and conflict, the last innovations in violence in mind. It takes a very long time to be implemented at the structural level. And it's quite mysterious as to how the sorts of local knowledge that scholars around the world are now uncovering about peace makes it in the international into the international system at all. But you can see that that's speeded up. So I'll give you an example. For example, the debates about local ownership and human security, people security, and so on in the UN system and in the donor system, which starts in the early 1990s, is really picked up from having an ear on the ground and increased contact with local social and civil movements, and inadvertently finds its way into some of the state donor institutions, JICA and DFID, and so on, and gets filtered into international doctrine and policy, and then becomes widely adopted. The problem is that what happens next is the wide doctrinal adoption of that type of knowledge is blocked at the implementation phase. So now we have a huge amount of very forward-looking, very critical doctrines, which would be quite comfortably put in front of local peace organizations, civil society actors, and conflict-affected societies anywhere in the world, which are being written into international doctrine, in the UN system and international law, in donor practice, and so on. Sorry, not practice, in donor doctrine, but they're not being implemented. So there's something about this phase between the adoption at the elite level of this type of practice, this type of knowledge, and the unwillingness or the lack of political will and lack of resources to actually implement them. Anyway, I could talk about that dimension quite a lot, but let me go back to the local in the last few minutes of my talk. So I'm putting a lot of weight on the shoulders of what we can probably all identify as local peace actors who find themselves or raise themselves above the sectarian oppositions, the dichotomies of their local contexts, and begin to speak multilingually in a way that they can communicate with donors and internationals, but also are able to communicate across the divides in their own conflict societies. And the only way that happens is because many of these civil society organizations, and here I'm thinking of organizations like the National Peace Council in Sri Lanka, or the bicommunal, intercommunal movement in Cyprus. These organizations come through, they often are standing on the shoulders of giants, but they also form themselves. And over time, through very wide-ranging contacts with either very small contextual groups attempting to bridge divides in politics in those situations, or more broadly at the regional and the international level, places where they're not at war, if you like, but they still have to bridge a lot of divides. And they're able to produce a form of dialogue, polygogue, which makes sense in all of those levels. And that allows the development of a political discourse about peacemaking. And it has, I think, in many of these contexts, from Cambodia to Timor-Leste to Colombia, Sierra Leone, over the last 3 or 4 decades, developed in ways which quite closely mirror liberal thinking on human rights, on the welfare state, on democratization, the rule of law, and so on and so forth. And that's partly because I think these were seen by those groups and organizations as being the most advanced political technology that was available on the planet in epistemological terms. So I don't think they were saying by their adoption of liberal thinking about peace over the last decades, that this is the best approach. And actually they have done a huge amount of work in pointing out the inconsistencies of these Western peacemaking and peacekeeping and development models, pointing out their hypocrisies, their underfunded nature, the distance between the reality of practice on the ground and the policy making, the doctrine making in the centers of power in Brussels, London, New York, Geneva, and so on and so forth. The need to make it culturally and historically appropriate, the need to translate it into local languages. In other words, we're talking here about hybrid forms of peace. And some of the work that I was doing in the 2000s was about how we connect the emergence of hybridity in political order with local movements that were trying to adopt human rights, democracy-based developmental approaches to peacemaking, who are also thinking through their own cultural, historical, and ideological experiences. For example, so many of those conflicts that peacemaking tools were being designed for by the UN system and by the donor system over the last decades were designed to mop up the conflicts that fell out of decolonization, that were left over from the imperial and colonial period, and also the conflicts that emerged from the collapse of the Soviet Union. So they had justice, ideological, power, cultural, historical, and developmental components. And of course, this is an incredible array of problems for any new country or conflict-affected society, divided society to face. So we're talking here about the minutiae, about the small networks of a nexus between peace scholarship and peace activism in conflict-affected societies, which were often also affected by imperialism, colonialism, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, as well as by the excesses of the West and its neoliberal turn after the end of the Cold War. So we should not overload these actors, either intellectually and conceptually, or in practice. But isn't that what we went on to do? I mean, in the 1990s and 2000s, there were huge amounts of expectations that civil society could save not just conflict-affected states, but also the entire Western peacemaking model, at the same time as funding being withdrawn, doctrines being redesigned in ways which still favored historical stratified understandings of international order dominated by the West, and looking for the cheapest solution possible. Now, just a few weeks ago, I was giving a talk a bit like this in the UN in New York, and I had cross-swords a little bit with some of the participants who were from within the Secretariat, who are looking to accommodate, let's say, Russian, Chinese, and Indian approaches to peacekeeping and diplomacy and mediation in the UN system, and also to accommodate it within peace building as a practice. And my sort of retort was that this is shifting UN peace building so far away from the kinds of political claims we're hearing on the ground, which are for cultural, historical identity, for structural redressal of inequality, for historical and distributive justice, for sustainability, for attempts to bring and understand better gender equality, for dealing with social deprivation across the different stratifications of society, for unpacking power. I mean, I gave a long list. And this was sort of dispatched as not being plausible within the peace building framework. So what that suggests to me is that we had a period where we have periods in this cycle between the production of knowledge about peace in local peacemaking organizations, which I can go into in more detail, but we don't have time. But I can direct you to an article I wrote which tried to do this. The adoption and this huge time lag between its adoption in the international architecture of peace, and then the blockage of implementation in that architecture, and then a shift away from the knowledge production in peacemaking, where we have this confluence, this network confluence between local actors and what they say on the ground, given their visceral knowledge of conflict, experience of conflict, and from the scholarship that's been developed across a range of disciplines in the now global academy about peace. And I think we're at one of those points. So for a while, this knowledge framework, civil society, social movements, and policy was kind of pulling together a little bit. The gap was closing, and now it's shooting apart again. And we're in a situation where it's become quite easy for peace builders, peacekeepers, diplomats, mediators, development specialists, and so on, to reject peace as a concept, in actual fact, which is exactly the opposite of what's happening on the ground in local peace movements. So I argued in some earlier work about peace formation, and this is just, I'll conclude here, but this is a concept which I developed to basically rebut the much more dominant concept of state formation. State formation argues that basically the kind of the war notion of states, that states form themselves through war and violence and crime and extraction, and they become power sharing entities with some weak checks and balances, but really what they're all about is about power and extraction, and with a few strange exceptions like the welfare state, that's where they tend to go. And that's why you should never trust the state, because even when it seems to be your friend, it has the potential to become the Leviathan. So there's this argument about state formation. There's a long historical process, very Western-centric argument too, about European state formation. And I wanted to mirror that and say, well, what happens and what can we see developing when local groups of actors come together to try to transcend their long-standing conflicts, which have been leading to bloodshed and material destruction, as well as the destruction of cultural and environmental infrastructure. What would happen to politics if these groups, and we can see examples of them in every conflict-affected society, and I think there are examples of that wider influence on the nature of international order building too. What would happen if they were forming politics? What kind of polity would emerge? And I would like to speculate that from that we would see one which did connect with many of the goals that have found themselves into the already dead letter, that is the UN's new Common Agenda for Peace, which is what I was discussing in New York a couple of weeks ago. The new agenda for peace that's being developed, which includes gender and sustainability and justice in its arrangement of peace and peacekeeping and mediation, diplomacy, development around the goals of the UN as a kind of outgrowth of the Charter and the work of the Secretariat and the agencies and these sorts of things, but it's a dead letter. So what we have is a confluence, again, between social movements and peace actors on the ground, the possibility of the production of doctrine at the international level, but non-implementation in practice, and indeed a kind of rejection in practice of its own doctrines by some of those who are operating within the system for political reasons, because they have to keep power on board. So herein lies the problem for peace formation. It has knowledge, it has networks, it has doctrine, it has mobility, it has some forms of social legitimacy and cultural and historical resonance. And it has a kind of ethical view of the survival of the biosphere at its heart, as other peace scholars have long pointed out, people like Galtung and a few others. So from these peace formation dynamics, we have to build on the already complex political, multilateral and legal order that exists. And we can see that peace formation is pushing it to be less state-centric, much more networked, digital, highly mobile, to expand consideration of rights, and yet to increase local legitimacy and representation, to redistribute resources, to improve human security. I mean, there are a long list of things which we can decisively say are shared across peace formation actors around the world, and therefore would be formative of a new form of peace, a new set of peacemaking tools, and a new international order or orders. if that were to come to fruition, which it might do in 300 years' time, judging by previous practice. So what this sort of points to more broadly is that peace formation actors, despite surviving in the kind of informal shadows of their local contexts, are quite highly politicized, very well informed, intuitively or scientifically, are slowly able to influence things, are very networks, can be very mobile, work across generations, have a justice and sustainability perspective, are able to secure themselves to operate in both public and informal space without too much risk, can step outside, can transcend the limitations of conventional domestic and political order, have used the platform of the liberal peace recently to try to develop further from, but are increasingly finding it too constrained and too limiting, have tried to build hybrid systems, but have found the power relations that any peace actors and any peace movement is up against quite overwhelming. So there's a list of kind of suppositions and ideas and assertions there, which help us think about the next stage of this broader international peace architecture. If we can put these things together and think about the massive growth in practice of peace formation, the massive increase in their contribution, both contextually and internationally, to a more peaceful form of politics and better understanding of peaceful political order, then we can start to build that next layer of this historic international peace architecture. And I think that's the sort of project that I've been involved in recently. I've been looking at the blockages to their work, what blocks them. And clearly power relations are one thing because they are small, they're not formal, they're not well resourced, but they have access to knowledge, mobility, networks, they are transversal, they are often transnational. They can work against power relations, even though it seems unlikely. But they are also blocks. And one of the blockages is the international architecture, the formal state system that we have today, the multilateral system that we have today. These systems, the UN system, the development system, these systems are now archaic, if not moribund, and need radical revision. And I suggest that these groups are starting to sketch out, if we can put the evidence together, where the system may go next. So I finish on a positive note, noting that they are quite marginal to contemporary politics in a kind of everyday presentist sense at the international scale, but not at the local scale. But noting also that they have historically filtered up to the international scale, and that we are now able to sketch out what these local social peace movements around the world are saying, and to draw some broader understanding of how to revise the international architecture, how to improve peace tools, how to build a new layer of this architecture, how to stabilize the past layers, and how to deal with new forms of conflict that are emerging, which are touching on issues of networks, technology, sustainability, resource use, land use, many of the things that have been very close to their agendas throughout the modern period. So these peace formation strategies are formative of a new political order, both domestically and internationally. And we have to now look around the disciplines and their methodologies to work out better ways, as scholars such as Roger McGinty has been doing, to read these signs and these indications, so that as academics, we can perhaps sketch out new schematics for a more peaceful international and domestic order for the future, drawing on that kind of knowledge. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Oliver, for this really intriguing overview of your work. Let me ask something as a matter of clarification and also to kick off a discussion. So you were basically saying that local actors have the capabilities and the potential to actually translate their ideas into the political architecture, but we're kind of overloaded with expectations by the international community also in the 90s, and they kind of need the international peace architecture in order to support them. Then those ideas were translated into progressive doctrines at the international level. I guess you also mean, among others, sustaining peace, for example. But then the translation in terms of supporting the local actors from the international level was or is kind of blocked due to several reasons. And what would interest me now are those reasons. You kind of indicated that there might be a lack of political will. I always had the impression, because there's also some kind of discussion going on. So we have sustaining peace work, but we're doing business as usual. So where's the problem? So what would you think? I have the impression that often it might be the over-complex bureaucratic international structure, that kind of bureaucrats sitting in their offices and just doing day-to-day work, not asking where the instructions came, why they should do something, and it kind of the outcome is some kind of business as usual mission. So I guess my question would be, might it not be eventually a pragmatic problem that the international peace architecture does not support the local actors in a way that they would need it? Or is it actually a political problem? Or both?
Do you want to directly respond, or should we take more further questions? I cannot, sorry, I cannot hear.
I can directly respond to that while other people
perfect.
are thinking of questions, if you like. Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question. This issue of why it is blocked. I mean, I think it's fairly obvious when you start engaging with local peace actors around the world that they don't have just bureaucratic critiques. They're not even domestic political critiques. I mean, often these are ideological and structural critiques, and they're touching on questions of distributive and historical justice, environmental justice, gender questions. I mean, these are big political questions. So that suggests to me that peacemaking and its tools, as we've been experiencing it in our kind of past 30 or 40 years, is really designed to maintain the current order without changing it. So there's very little room for development, for structural change in the post-89 international system. Now, I think that's incredibly problematic for most scholars, by the way, across disciplines, because we can clearly see that this system is eating itself. But of course, for peace activists who have been at the sharp end, I mean, war is an outgrowth of the dysfunctionality of domestic and international politics, the inability to distribute resources, to respect different identity groups, to think across generations about broader questions of justice, and to provide a basic and decent living with integrity. And that sort of perspective, such as that last sentence, has become an anathema to many of those who are sitting in international institutions or are controlling foreign policy in their states or their development ministries, who are called upon, at least professionally, to see the structural hierarchy of states in international order as more or less eternal. There being a kind of race to the top, but in no way can there be any slippage. And for as long as we have those sorts of perspectives, we don't have sustainable politics. That's where the science goes. So if peacemaking tools are appended to that kind of hierarchical and extractive historical politics, then they can never do more really than dampen down the violence. Mike Pugh used to call it riot control. Now, the political agendas that we're getting from our local partners, sources, scholars, activists are much more wide-ranging than this. We still live in an international order in which our peacemaking tools are more or less designed to throw up cordons sanitaires around conflict and to isolate us from it. And that system, I think, keeps breaking down. I mean, we saw it notably with the kind of risks of what they were calling infection, with the Balkan Wars, and then with the war on terror. We saw it across sub-Saharan Africa again, with the kind of next forgotten world war that was been taking place, the Middle East, the failure of the wave of revolutions, and so on. I mean, these things aren't just internal failures; they're structural failures of international order. So blockages. We've been working on this, myself, Gazim Vizoka and Sandra Pagoda, and we've come to the conclusion that there are kind of tactical blockages in peace processes. And often these tactical blockages come from elite actors and regional hegemons, and they're designed to target the political claims that are being made by local groups for accommodation, for pluralism, and for various forms of justice, and to push them back. And the reason for that is because they offer a structural challenge to hegemony, both within the state and within the international system, in the regional system, in the political marketplace of conflict politics, if you like. So what we've had is we've seen how easy it is to spoil a peace process become a common lesson over the last 30 or 40 years. And we've seen, I think, that both the Western peacemakers, mediators, and UN peacekeepers, peace builders, and development specialists, as well as humanitarians, have become adept at adopting a discourse and a language which is designed to produce a stalemate in conflict-affected societies, not a peace outcome. Not a peace outcome that would be measurable and have integrity when compared to the scholarship that's been developing on peacemaking. So we've got the emergence through these blockages, these small tactical blockages of stalemate forms of peacemaking and a stalemate international system, which is breaking apart. The second part of our research suggests that stalemates tend to collapse. They may be long-term, but they never end up unfreeing themselves. They end up getting worse. Now, what this is suggesting then is that, for example, if you look at peacekeeping, peacekeepers, small forces designed to maintain some kind of status quo ceasefire situation, to provide a basis for civil society and for political elites to mediate outcomes, to create more pluralistic dialogue, this kind of thing. I mean, everything's very overloaded here. It's very, very easy to push back against peacekeepers without upsetting the peace process. So you can stop them operating as a platform for civil society to become more dynamic, for mediators to reach an agreement, for new security agreements to be reached in an extremely easy and cheap way. So this can easily become a systematic process. Blockages can become systematic, and when they become systematic, they then threaten to have regional and international dimensions. And I think that's exactly what we've seen with the failure of stalemate peacekeeping in Ukraine in 2014 and the outbreak of this major regional war since. There's nothing that any local actor or any local peace movement could have done about that process. And that's the limitation of local peacemaking, peace formation. It provides knowledge and legitimacy, networks, mobility, and so on, but it doesn't have the levers. It's unfeasible to ask local peacemakers to cut off the king's head. One, they wouldn't do that because they're mostly pacifists, and two, they don't have any power whatsoever. They only have this kind of discursive power, which connects them to the past and to the future of political order in their own context, and very slowly, more widely. So I think we can do a lot more work on that, but it's not a bureaucratic problem. It's a political problem. Because at the end of the day, they are often asking the question, how can we live sustainably with justice and respect on this planet? Whereas what's emerged from liberal peace building from the West, and also now from the other poles in international order, is the question, how can we dominate this planet? And that was a question we thought was put to rest with the failure of fascism. But it re-emerged with a kind of liberal hegemony during the Cold War, and that provided an excuse for other ideological poles, the resurgence of authoritarian and illiberal thinking, the reneging on the expanding rights claims that were being turned into doctrine through the treaty system of international order. I mean, things are going backwards extremely quickly. And that's why I'm suggesting that now is a time to read and scale up what local peace actors and local knowledge, contextual knowledge and comparative knowledge about peacemaking has produced. And let's not forget that here we are today. I mean, most of us, I guess, are from the global north or from institutions in the global north right at this present. And that can be problematic because it's, a kind of a metropolitan perspective of global history and so on. But we have never had so much data, and we've never had so many conceptual developments, and we've never been more broadly networked and widely networked across the planet instantaneously with access to that knowledge and data. So the potential peace movement, the potential peace epistemology that emerges out of this moment should be far better than anything that's gone before, because our methodological tools and our practical tools are far more substantial.
Thank you, Oliver, for answering the question in detail and also for your great keynote speech. Now I want to open up for a little bit the space for Q&A, because there are so many experts on the local level, but also there are so many academics, as far as I can see in the chat, on the field of peace and conflict studies. So I'm sure there are a lot of questions, and maybe someone wants to comment. Juliana.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for your very interesting presentation or talk. I want to, or have a question regarding the note you ended with, that in order to sort of birth, thinking about other systems, alternatives to the hegemony, we should draw on the knowledge that has been created and that local peace actors hold. And sort of theorize alternatives out of it. And to me, on the one hand, this sounds a little bit like extractivist knowledge production. On the other hand, I'm wondering whether we as academics and whether academia in general, is the right place to do so, being embedded in neoliberal logics by ways of funding, also by ways of ideology.
Thank you. That's a very good question and perspective. Where would you propose it's done? I mean, so this is the problem, and I don't want to suggest that you're not on the right track, but I think we need a structural solution to the problems that you raise. So the one is that we have this kind of metropolitan extractive knowledge production, and the other is that the Western academy is now becoming so neoliberal that it's almost impossible to maintain an ethical research agenda in that context. And I think they're both absolutely spot on. However, other academies around the world that are emerging are in the same state. And as I mentioned several times in my little talk, social movements and peace actors in conflict-affected societies are seriously overloaded and also much more insecure than they ever have been before. So while, for example, what we're doing here is not perfect, at least we're doing it. The very important methodological point is to remember that we don't have to think in terms of the binary logics of us studying them, but we can form networks and teams. And part of local peace formation thinking, as I imagined it, was that we would reconstitute the hegemony of epistemology away from the centralized authority figure that scholarship traditionally depended upon, and decentralize and disaggregate it back towards these kinds of discursive polylog groups that are able to, through experience as well as through knowledge, connect with and develop either reactive or more substantial responses to actual conflicts that they are experiencing. And I think we've gone quite a long way in that direction. I mean, if I was to say out of 10 steps, we've taken maybe 2. But I think before this generation, so my generation of scholarship emerged, we were still very much on step 0. And our generation was motivated by a desire to build much more global networks to think about peace, to revive the kind of post-1940s knowledge on peace, which was institutionalism, liberal international law, and regionalization, federation, mediation, peacekeeping, and to do better with those things. So I certainly accept your underlying thesis that this is far too limited now, but it's part of the architecture, and it's upon that the next phases, next layers need to be built. So I think we're not trying to do extractivist knowledge, but of course, every time we engage with one of the past generations or our own generations' methodologies or epistemologies or concepts, we realize that it has limitations. And it's the next step then to deal with that, your generation probably to deal with that. In terms of, is academia a place to do this? I appreciate your point that there is a risk that academia is a business, and we've lost sight of the ethical grounds of knowledge production. By the way, the Enlightenment basis for knowledge production, the rational application of scientific knowledge, and so on and so forth. And I think these things are definitely damaged. But academia, in my experience, is a place where you can talk to policymakers, go around the world, build networks. You can start to see that transversal, transnational, new international, new peace kind of shimmering into existence somewhere in the far horizon, because you're not necessarily quite as constrained by sectarian viewpoints in context, by the elite stratifications of your own society, by the state system and sovereign borders, by the distribution of resources. I mean, you're still constrained by those things, but not as constrained by them. I mean, I would suggest that we scholars need to fight for our autonomy and independence, and to keep universities on the right track and not do what we're told all the time, but say no and move on if your institution might accept it. Anyway, that's a divergence, but it's still the only place we can do this work. Now, if you were to try and do it in civil society, you would get the same complaints, plus you wouldn't have any resources, and you probably would have very little access. Because there's also a hierarchy, as we know, within the civil society peace movements and all the rest of it. Some of them are lucky and get funded by Norway or Sweden. Many of them, have to apply for bits of funding from the British Development Agency or from USAID or something, and don't, there are a lot of constraints on what they can do. If they tick the is this a business rollout idea box, they get the money. But there's no box which says, does this further sustainability and justice across society? So there's a lot that we as academics can do and can offer. It's only a talking shop, but we do build networks and links. And I think we are part of, or we could be part of, that historic formation of new political orders. Not necessarily because we're influential or because we're authority figures, not at all. But it's just that we are a part of the production of knowledge, not the only part. Universities form to disseminate knowledge and to produce new knowledge. Many of those neoliberal universities that you're talking about here disseminate knowledge but don't produce new knowledge. They disseminate ideological knowledge. Well, we can do something about that. Most of our students already realize that. So I wouldn't be so kind of hard on Western universities. And we are working hard on building links we have been working hard on building links across the world. And yeah, there's interesting things to be said about that. So, the conflicts of the faculties that Kant once imagined would be the way in which a university, a sovereign territorialized university, would produce knowledge. So the faculties, being around the university and fighting a battle over the truth. And he imagined it in a very small space, a campus or a city. That's now become a global fight. And the global south is there. Non-Western actors are there. Different actors from different stratifications across the global system, including civil society actors, are part of that. This is a polylogue. And I think that's pretty important. We don't really understand where it's going to go and what it means. But I think we can point to some parameters emerging about our thinking about peacemaking from what's been going on, let's say, most substantially in the last 10 years. But thanks for that interesting and provocative point.
So I want to read a question in the chat. Laura Zister asked you, now I want to read it. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I'm sorry if the question was already answered. I'm in Bolivia right now and problems with the internet connection, but I was wondering if the local is looked as a homogeneous entity, especially in the international arena of peace building. Right now, the discourse is more about including the local in peace building, but the question is which local actors and institutions are included or heard, because this selection is in itself political and sometimes undermines marginalization within civil society and the local level itself, because not all local peace actors have the resources to develop capacities to communicate on the local as well as on the international level. And yeah, so I want to pass this. I had a similar question for myself. I wondered if it's on clearly on just epistemic level the problem, or is it more on the power structure? Like Boaventura de Sousa Santos wrote about it, and he said it's an epistemicide. So, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a very long time ago, right at the beginning of these sorts of debates, I wrote an article which was called The Romanticisation of the Local. And, the idea of that article was to say that Western peacemakers, as it was back then, this was sort of before peace building had really become a kind of major policy concept, tended to see the local as a kind of homogenous space, which was to be persuaded, coerced, or cajoled into accepting that their scientific parameters of liberal peace, and also they tended to see it in a kind of stratified intellectual sense, that these were people who need to be educated into the new ways of political order. So there was a kind of multiple distance between those who were acting in the interests of diplomacy and mediation and peacekeeping and so on, and the redesigning the constitutional and economic reform of political systems. And their subjects. And I think we've moved a little bit away from that. I mean, even though we are Western and quite Eurocentric, and we do tend to still focus on things like rational actors and individualism or individualistic modes of knowledge. But I think we have somehow got over that sense, and there has been a sort of repoliticization of how we understand local politics, looking for the politics, looking for the kinds of issues that drive different ideological predispositions, and looking for the groups that try to bridge these with historical and contextual awareness as well as international awareness. And that is often the peace actors, the civil society peace actors in those societies. So we're trying to get that sort of thing into a broader perspective, that we're not talking about the wider society, but we're seeing that all of these groups, from local society to social movements to civil society to international peace actors within the international system, are in relational contexts, they are entangled. And it's not methodologically plausible to see them as separate. You know, they operate in waves. They have different levels of power. And that's what shapes politics. So breaking down those conceptual and methodological barriers and these silos helps us have a better understanding of the local political claims that are made, how they're made and who makes them, which are commensurate with the most ethically grounded knowledge on peacemaking in the wider international global academy that has emerged. All of that is a moving target. The global academy is expanding, new voices are adding new dimensions to our understanding of peace from different locales, contextual or regional, non-South, East, West, and all the rest of it. I mean, the study of peace has gained an enormous momentum over the last few decades when compared to, you know, for example, when I started, and there were just 3 or 4 concepts and a bit of history of the developments of the European Union and peacekeeping and a bit of mediation and diplomacy, and that was it, you know. So we're in a much better methodological space now to understand this disaggregation, not to romanticize the local, to understand the politics and its dynamics, not to overload civil society, but to understand the claims that are being made and to be able to track how they shape and influence political and international behavior if they do. So yes, I think this is agonistic. This is not about producing harmony. I mean, this is not peace as a beautiful paradise or, I don't know, the silence of the cemetery, but it's a peace which is based on discursive, dialogic, polylogic political contestation of the ability to live sustainably in justice on this planet. So the register's shifted from politics as being the contest over the distribution of material resources, the extractivist context. It's shifting into this more kind of, at least in the scientific, at the scientific level. So, well, I guess I can say more specifically about that. That means we need to look at those peace movements in local context and see what they're saying, and to compare them what Westerners are saying, or the Chinese are saying, or other donors, but also to compare them with what is being said at the political level about what kinds of political claims would settle the conflict and what sorts of tools are needed. And then everybody, I would suggest, from my experience of this, that the closest to the scholarship will be what these peace movements are saying, not what the political leaders are saying, not what the elites, the economic elites are saying, not what the regional hegemons are saying, for the most part. So that suggests to me that there is a possibility of this association or alliance or networks being built, which are formative of the future international system, future international peace architecture. So, you know, I think we have to be careful with the very negative epistemology of these local actors, because I find it hard to see where else we're going to go for knowledge about peace. If it's not going to be just the Western Academy, then who else is it going to be? And of course, the other caveat is it's very important to remember that powerful actors are far more powerful than the peace actors in this framing, have far more to lose from a peace agreement, will generally refuse to make concessions that affect them either personally or their constituencies. In other words, peacemaking is not just about finding a more harmonious but agonistic framing for local politics. It's also about finding ways of dismantling power, and particularly long-term historical, cultural, economic forms of power.
Thank you, Oliver. I see that, David, you have also a question, but unfortunately the time is running, and we have actually 3 more panels, and so I hope you all understand that at some point we need to stop the conversation. I mean, I could listen to you, Oliver, for days, but unfortunately time is running. So if everybody agrees, we can move on.